Azemmour, Morocco breathed salt air and river wind as a young boy named Mustapha ran through its narrow alleys. He never imagined his childhood would be the last part of his life lived by choice. Portuguese soldiers raided the coast, capturing him and tearing him from his family forever. Dragged across the sea to Portugal, he was chained, sold, and renamed Esteban by men who saw him as property. Bought by the Spanish nobleman Andrés de Rontes, he was forced into a new world he never chose. Rumors swirled through Spain of golden kingdoms waiting across the ocean. Esteban understood that one man's opportunity was often another man's disaster. The Narvaez expedition began forming hundreds of soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and servants gathering in a crowded port. Empires hungered for land and wealth, but Esteban saw only desperate men sailing toward the unknown. He stood on the deck and looked back at the white walls of Azemmour, knowing he would never return. In June 1527, the ships pushed into the Atlantic, carrying Esteban toward a continent no one truly understood. What none of them knew was that he was stepping into one of history's most catastrophic expeditions. The journey toward Floridand, toward 8 years of survival, had quietly begun. The Narvaez fleet reached the Caribbean battered by storms that swallowed supplies and scattered ships like driftwood. Men whispered that the voyage was cursed, but Narvaez swore the land ahead would make them kings. Esteban watched the officers celebrate plans drawn on maps that were mostly guesswork. The expedition pressed on toward Florida, trusting charts that were wrong by hundreds of miles. When they landed near present-day Tampa Bay, they expected gold but found only swamps thick with heat and biting insects. Narvaez split the expedition, sending the ships along the coast while he led the men inland, a decision that doomed them. Esteban marched with the land party through marshes that swallowed horses and left armor rusting on men's backs. Disease thinned their numbers, and hunger turned every day into a trial of endurance. Indigenous villagers greeted them with caution, generosity, or arrows, depending on how the Spanish had behaved before. Esteban quickly realized that understanding languages meant survival, so he listened, learned, and observed every gesture. As weeks dragged into months, the men realized the ships were gone, lost forever along the coast. Stranded in an unforgiving wilderness, the expedition began building crude rafts in a desperate attempt to escape. Esteban helped lash timber together, knowing these rafts were more prayer than plan. When they pushed offshore, storms tore at them, drowning dozens and scattering what remained of the expedition. Esteban clung to driftwood as waves carried him toward a fate no one could have predicted. This was no longer a mission of glory, only a fight to stay alive. The Gulf of Mexico hurled Esteban and the survivors onto a barren stretch of shoreline where crashing waves buried the past behind them. Cold rains soaked their torn clothes as they realized there were fewer than 80 men left alive from the original 600. Their rafts lay in pieces along the beach, scattered like the bones of a broken dream. The Karankawa people found them starving, freezing, and too weak to lift a sword. Some Karankawa offered food and shelter, bewildered by the wrecked strangers who had washed into their world. Others saw the Spaniards' desperation and feared what starving men might do to survive. Disease struck the survivors harder than any enemy, killing men by the dozens as winter tightened its grip. Esteban learned quickly that respect, humility, and listening mattered more than weapons here. He began trading small tasks for food, using gestures and patience to build a fragile trust with indigenous families. Narvaez, however, refused to accept the reality of survival and attempted another escape, vanishing into the sea and never returning. The remaining castaways broke into small groups, searching the coastline for anything that resembled safety. Hunger hollowed their faces, and death traveled beside them like an unseen companion. Esteban discovered that some indigenous groups expected the newcomers to work for their keep, treating them more like captives than guests. For months, Esteban lived among different communities, learning languages, customs, and the rhythms of their daily life. He carried firewood, fetched water, repaired nets, anything to stay alive one more day. What kept him going was a quiet belief that survival was its own form of resistance. Slowly, painfully, 3 other survivors found him: Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Castillo, men who had wandered the coast in equal misery. Reunited by fate, the 4 realized they were alone in a vast continent, bound together by desperation and the faint hope of escape. Their journey as castaways had reshaped them into something. Spain would never recognize men who now understood the land better than the conquerors ever planned. What waited ahead was not rescue but a path carved by survival, chance, and the fragile alliances they had yet to build. The four survivors stood on a lonely gulf shore and understood that no ships were coming, no rescue was possible. They had one choice left: walk across a continent no European had ever crossed. Esteban took the lead, because he was the only one who could speak with the peoples they met along the way. He listened to every language, learned every gesture, and watched every custom until communication became second nature to him. In each village they entered, Esteban stepped forward first, not as a conqueror, but as a man asking for mercy. Some communities welcomed them with food, warmth, and stories shared by firelight. Others watched them with suspicion, remembering how previous Spanish strangers had brought violence. Esteban became the group's translator, negotiator, healer, and sometimes the only reason they were allowed to live. Cabeza de Vaca recorded that indigenous families trusted Esteban more than the Spaniards who claimed authority over him. As months turned into years, the four survivors followed trade routes older than their homeland, guided by those who knew the land best. They walked through deserts that cracked under the sun and plains alive with buffalo herds they had never imagined. At night they slept beneath starfields so wide they felt drowned in light and silence. Esteban learned healing techniques from shamans and midwives, using herbs and rituals to soothe the sick along their journey. When he helped heal a child or a hunter, entire villages opened their doors to the travelers. Word spread ahead of them, men of power were coming, one of them carrying gifts from the sky. Esteban often walked miles ahead, entering villages alone, trusting that his courage would earn trust in return. Communities offered them food, guides, and knowledge of distant regions, turning strangers into allies. The four survivors realized they were becoming part of the land rather than passing through it. Their clothes wore away, their weapons rusted, and the identity of conquerors slipped from their shoulders like old skin. They were no longer soldiers of an empire, they were wanderers finding humanity in every step of the continent. By the time they reached the edge of northern Mexico, Esteban had become something rare in the 1500s, a bridge between worlds no one else had ever learned how to cross. As the four survivors pushed deeper into northern Mexico, word traveled farther ahead of them than their footsteps. Villagers spoke of a dark-skinned healer who carried the breath of powerful spirits. Esteban never claimed such power, but he understood that belief could save lives just as surely as medicine. He learned healing from indigenous elders, herbs for fever, smoke for swelling, chants that calmed the dying. Cabeza de Vaca used Christian prayers while Esteban used knowledge gathered from 100 families. Together, they created a style of healing neither European nor indigenous, but something born from shared survival. When Esteban placed his hands on the sick, people whispered that he carried the strength of distant gods. Communities began traveling great distances to seek his help, bringing children, elders, and wounded hunters. The survivors who once begged for food now found themselves welcomed with reverence and respect. Cabeza de Vaca later admitted that Esteban's presence opened doors that would have remained shut to any Spaniard. Their journey became a trail of small miracles, each healed person another step toward hope. People began gifting them corn, cloaks, obsidian tools, and guides who knew the safest paths to travel. The four men walked in a growing procession of those who believed they were holy travelers. Esteban, once enslaved and voiceless, now stood proudly at the front, shaping the path of the entire group. His ability to read emotions and respond with compassion became their greatest weapon of survival. They crossed vast plains where storms rolled across the horizon like moving mountains of rain. They entered forests alive with birdsong where the path beneath their feet felt softer than anything they'd known in years. In every new region, Esteban adapted again, learning new dialects, new customs, new ways to greet strangers. To some, he was a healer. To others, a messenger from the far edge of the world. By the time they neared Spanish settlements, Esteban's reputation stretched for hundreds of miles. The empire that had once enslaved him had no idea the man they called property had become a legend across the continent. After 8 years walking the continent, the four survivors finally approached the outskirts of Spanish territory. The scent of horses, the clang of metal tools, and the distant shouts of soldiers told them they were nearing an empire they had almost forgotten. They arrived at a frontier settlement, ragged, barefoot, and unrecognizable from the men who had sailed years before. Spaniards stared in disbelief as indigenous families gathered around them in awe, calling them holy travelers. The settlers welcomed Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Castillo as heroic Spaniards who had cheated death. But they looked at Esteban with the cold familiarity reserved for what they believed he still was property. The world he returned to had not changed simply because he had. Spanish officials questioned the men for hours, demanding every detail about the lands they had crossed. They wanted to know about rivers, mountains, villages, and most of all rumors of wealthy cities to the north. Cabeza de Vaca spoke cautiously, but others indulged Spain's hunger for new conquests. Esteban listened in silence, realizing that the stories he had helped shape were now being twisted into a map for another invasion. Word spread quickly that the 4 castaways had returned with tallies of vast territories rich with unknown peoples. To the Spanish crown, this was not a miracle of survival but an opportunity for expansion. Esteban hoped that his years of service, courage, and leadership would earn him a life of freedom and dignity. Instead, his legal status remained unchanged. He was still listed as a slave belonging to Andres de Rentes. Freedom dangled just out of reach, almost close enough to grasp, but never offered. When Spanish officials needed a guide for their next northern expedition, they didn't ask Esteban, they assigned him. His journey across the continent had made him indispensable, but not equal. He walked the familiar paths of captivity again, but now with the knowledge of a man who had crossed worlds. Even so, he stepped forward, believing his skills could build a new life. Even if the empire that owned him refused to see his worth, the next expedition would not return him to freedom, it would carry him into legend. Rumors spread through Spanish settlements of 7 golden cities shimmering somewhere in the northern desert. Officials dreamed of empires, treasure, and new lands ripe for conquest, and they needed someone who knew the way. Esteban was chosen not because he was valued, but because he was useful. He knew the languages, the trails, and the people. He was placed under the command of Fray Marcos de Niza, a friar who carried Spain's ambition like a flame in his hands. Esteban led the vanguard, traveling days ahead of the main party, as he had during the years of survival. Indigenous communities greeted him with respect, offering shelter, guides, and stories about distant regions. They trusted him more than the men who followed behind with crosses and conquest in their eyes. Every village added to his growing reputation, calling him a healer, a messenger, or a man blessed by powerful spirits. As he moved north, he carried small gifts meant to show peace bells, beads, and feathers that symbolized safe passage. People who saw him believed he came in friendship, not in hunger for their lands. The desert opened before him in vast sweeps of red earth, where the sky pressed down like a dome of burning light. Esteban crossed canyons, mesas, and endless plains with the confidence of a man who had walked a continent before. Whispers of the so-called 7 cities reached his ears, some filled with marvel, others filled with warning. He knew legends often hid truths, but he also knew Spain would cling to any hint of riches no matter the cost. Still, Esteban continued forward, hoping this journey might finally earn him freedom and a future of his own making. When he reached the edge of Zuni territory, he sent word back to Fray Marcos that he was entering a new world. He carried with him guides, gifts, and the hope that the Zuni would greet him as an honored guest. But the Zuni had seen strangers before, strangers who brought destruction, not peace. Their memories were long. Esteban stepped toward the pueblo at Hawiku, unaware that destiny was waiting on the other side of its walls. His footsteps that morning would lead him into the moment that turned a survivor into a legend. Esteban approached the Zuni settlement of Hawiku, carrying gifts in his hands and hope in his heart. He had walked thousands of miles across the continent, trusting that courage and respect would carry him safely once again. The Zuni watched him from their rooftops, studying the stranger who traveled ahead of the Spaniards. They had heard of outsiders before outsiders who took land, food, and lives, and their caution was shaped by bitter memory. Esteban's entourage of guides and messengers worried as they watched the Zuni remain silent and unmoving. He stepped forward anyway, believing that goodwill could bridge the fear between unfamiliar worlds. The gifts he offered were symbols of peace, but the Zuni saw the shadow of conquest following behind him. When he reached the gates of Hawiku, the Zuni did not welcome him, they surrounded him. His companions ran, warning Fray Marcos that the meeting had gone terribly wrong. What happened next was swift and final. The Zuni killed Esteban, ending the life of the first African explorer of the American Southwest. News of his death traveled south slowly, tangled in fear, misunderstanding, and the politics of empire. Fray Marcos claimed he witnessed signs of cities rich with gold, using Esteban's death as proof of danger and grandeur. The Spanish crown seized on the tale, transforming his final moments into propaganda for future conquests. Esteban, who had survived storms, hunger, slavery, and a continent itself, died at the threshold of a village he had hoped to befriend. His body was left behind, but his story began to move like fire through the imagination of Europe. The man who once walked as property was now spoken of as a fallen guide to golden kingdoms. No Spanish record mourned him, yet indigenous oral histories remembered him as a wandering healer and messenger. In death, as in life, Esteban remained a man caught between worlds, claimed by none, remembered by all. His last walk was not a journey into wealth or fame, but into the deep complexity of the land he had learned to call home. The desert wind carried away his final footprints, but not the legend of the man who made them. Esteban's death became a canvas onto which every culture painted its own version of him. To the Spanish, he was a guide who died at the doorstep of imagined golden cities. To Fray Marcos, he was a convenient martyr whose loss justified exaggerations of wealth and danger. To future conquistadors, Esteban was the first proof that the northern lands held something worth invading. But to indigenous communities across the southwest, he remained the dark-skinned traveler who healed the sick and listened with respect. Some remembered him as a holy man, others as a mysterious outsider who walked between worlds. Oral traditions carried his name farther than any Spanish chronicle ever chose to. For generations, people told stories of a wandering figure who arrived with gifts and left behind echoes. Historians struggled to piece together the real Esteban because the truth had been fractured by conquest, myth, and empire. What they agreed on was simple: no one else in the 16th century had crossed as much land, met as many nations, or survived as many trials. His journey stretched across Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico long before any maps existed. He traversed landscapes that would later become states, borders, and nations, though he knew them only as living worlds connected by humanity. He spoke more indigenous languages than any European explorer of his era, despite being denied an education. He built alliances through empathy, understanding that kindness traveled farther than any weapon. Though enslaved, he often walked ahead as the de facto leader, the man who negotiated, translated, and protected the group. His life blurred the lines between survivor and explorer, captive and diplomat, outsider and essential guide. In a time obsessed with conquest, Esteban embodied something far rarer: connection across cultures. He proved that exploration was not only measured in miles crossed, but in relationships formed. Behind every myth of riches and conquest stood the reality of a man carved from resilience, intelligence, and quiet courage. The legend of Esteban was built by others, but the truth of who he was belonged to the land he crossed and the people who remembered him. Centuries after his death, Esteban the Moor remains one of the most remarkable figures in early American history. He crossed a continent long before its borders existed, and long before Europeans understood the world they were invading. He survived not by force, but by listening, learning, and respecting the cultures he met along the way. His life challenged the empire that claimed to own him, proving that knowledge and courage cannot be chained. Though Spain never honored him, the land remembered his footsteps more clearly than any crown ever could. In the southwest, stories linger of a dark-skinned traveler who healed the sick and brought distant news from far-off coasts. Some indigenous communities still recall him as a stranger who walked with humility instead of conquest. Modern historians now see Esteban as one of the first African explorers of North America, title earned through survival, not ceremony. His journey reveals the hidden truth that the earliest chapters of American exploration were written by people far outside power. His life restores humanity to an era often told only through kings, governors, and conquistadors. Esteban stands as proof that history's greatest pathfinders are not always the men whose names appear on monuments. He reminds us that the world was shaped by wanderers, translators, healers, and survivors, people who lived between cultures and carried knowledge across them. His courage carved a route through deserts, plains, and forests that would later guide armies, settlers, and empires. Even in death, he changed history, sparking expeditions that reshaped the continent, for better and for worse. Yet the heart of his story remains the same: a boy taken from Azemmouri who walked farther than any of the men who owned him. A man who turned survival into leadership and tragedy into legacy. A forgotten explorer who crossed worlds not to conquer them, but because he refused to stop moving forward. His footsteps have faded from the sand, but the truth of his life still echoes through the land he once walked. Esteban the Moor lives on in the quiet corners of history where the lost, the brave, and the overlooked finally find their voice. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history.